First of all, I'm very excited this morning to have you with me, Max Maxwell, the original Max Maxwell from Winston-Salem. So today we're going to be having some off-the-cuffs, real conversation about police interactions and want your perspective about police interactions as an African-American male. So welcome to the show.
I appreciate you having me, Sheriff. And one thing is, I actually want to say it's courageous for you to actually have a podcast, because what it does is it gives people the inside look of a sheriff's office and an inside look of your brain, but it also leaves you vulnerable for people to pick apart your words and every word you're going to say on these podcasts. So I commend you for that, for being like the community sheriff here in Winston-Salem.
Well, I appreciate that. But one of the things that we talked about was transparency. In order for people to gain trust, you must be transparent. In order to transform people, we believe that you must be transparent. So I realize that we're opening up ourselves, and I'm opening up myself to a lot of criticisms, a lot of people Monday morning quarterbacking.
Absolutely.
What I say and how I say it.
Yep.
But I welcome that. I welcome the challenge. I knew that coming in. I knew that when we said we wanted to do the podcast. So I'm excited about it. And as they say, let's get it.
Well, let's do. I'm glad to be a guest on here, one of the first guests, and I'm interested to see where this goes.
Okay. Well, like I said, today we want to talk about police interactions. You know, every day in our society, the police are interacting with the community. But there's a specific community that seems to have, whether it's conflict, issues, interactions, when they have interactions with law enforcement. And when we started this podcast, one of the things we want to do was be transparent, have people speak the truth, how they feel about it, and allow us to address some of the concerns. And let's talk about it. So as an African-American male, how do you feel about police interactions? What do you think about policing in this day and time?
Well, I think for one, I think policing in general from the time it started to now has completely changed. I think there's a lot of issues. There's more mental health issues. There's a lot of things going on, right? So I think more now than ever, police have to be trained way better than they were trained before, because there's so many different outcomes that can happen from interacting with the community, people on different levels, mental capacities, all types of things. So I think just better training on the police side would help, and not even training. I think maybe we've even talked about this before, but maybe just looking at law enforcement in general in a different light. It should be more like it should go back to community policing and less of a them versus us. But I also believe if you're going to train the officers, you also need to educate the public on what is expected when, an actual stop happens or when there's interactions. Because we all know policing is a dangerous job, right?
True, very, very true.
But so both sides fear now in the African-American community, now both sides, when the interaction happens, fear of who's going home. And being former military, at the end of the day, I was always going to go home. That was just my job. No matter what I went out and did, I had to make sure I come home. And that's the same thing when an officer goes out there and when a civilian has that interaction. So I think that the education, and it needs to be spoken about more in public, right? One, from a sitting sheriff, right? Not from somebody retired on news, on CNN, but from somebody that's actively the sheriff of a large community. I think you got to take that responsibility and have more of that conversation with your officers, and then also with the community itself.
Well, that's a good point. One of the things that I try to put out into the community is that when someone is stopped by law enforcement, whether it's the sheriff, police, highway patrol, that officer, that deputy, that trooper is just another individual that's serving that community or that state. And at the end of the day, they too want to go home.
Absolutely.
They're doing a job, a profession that they chose. And as I think you and I were talking before we started, is that only one of them is trained at that situation. The other one is a motorist. The other one is a novelist. The other one is a trained professional on how to do that stop. So I think a lot of times at that traffic stop, a lot of emotions are whirling around and a lot of unknowns, a lot of preconceived thoughts.
Absolutely.
A lot of nervousness. So I think that once we realize that that officer, that deputy is there to do a job. Now, I get it. I'm not so naive that I know that there are things that sometimes that should not happen on the road. I get that. I understand that. But I think that that officer, for the most part, men and women across this country that serve and protect are by and far good people.
I believe so too.
They come to the job every day with the mindset, I come to serve the people in the community which I have been selected. And so what happens sometimes, miscues send us down the wrong path because an officer is responding to the behavior that he or she is given. It's just like in anything in life, the behavior determines the experience. The experience is based on the behavior. So at the side of the road, you have two people who don't even know each other. One is being stopped for a traffic violation. So what I tell people is this, is that when you're stopped by an officer, the first thing you want to do is never become combative on the side of the road. Always comply to what he or she is asking you. The side of the road is not a place to try your case. It's not a place to show that you know more than the officer. It's not a place to show that you have dominance and you're going to exert your dominance on that officer. It's never going to work out. Because at the end of the day, what you must realize is that that officer has a lot of discretionary power. He or she can give you a verbal warning. He or she can give you a written warning. He or she can give you a citation. And depending on how fast you are going, it's an arrestable offense. And so it could cost you a lot of financial hardship on the side of the road. And if it really goes south or goes bad, you could be arrested. And so, but you can avoid that. And we always talk about this thing about atmosphere. You controlling that atmosphere. You giving input into that atmosphere. So if the officer stops you, yes, sir, no, ma'am, or even yes, no, yes, keep your hands where they can see them. Comply with what they're asking you. Never become confrontational. Keep your hands where they can see them. And every move that you make, let them know, sir, if you're asking for my license or my registration, it's in my glove box. Just don't make sudden moves like that. It's the sudden moves that make most officers nervous, uncomfortable. And engage the officer. Realize that if you feel uncomfortable, and sir, could you call for someone else? I feel uncomfortable. You know, express yourself, but in a non-threatening manner. If you feel you need to express yourself.
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying, and I also believe that, you know, I don't know the transition period of when a traffic stop was just a traffic stop, and neither side really felt threatened. It was like, oh, I'm getting a ticket. Right. I got to go to court. I got to pay this. Now it's a traffic stop. You know, will I survive? Right. So whatever that transition period, and I don't know when that happened and when it became more common for people not to survive a traffic stop. I think we need to go back to when it was just, you know, and I don't know how big of a town people live in, but, oh, I'm being pulled over by officer such and such. You know, I'm going to get a ticket. That should be the end of that. But, you know, I totally understand that when officers train, they prepare for the worst and hope the best. So in the back of their head, that training is going when you do a simple traffic stop for speeding and it turns into an officer-involved shooting where an officer gets shot. So that is running through an officer's mind. And then you have the civilian where it turns into a traffic stop and it turns into an officer-involved shooting where an innocent person gets shot. So now you have two sides that always are prepared for the worst. And I hope that both of them are working for the best, but I understand both sides. I think it's just going to go down to, and it's just not a simple switch that we can turn to fix this issue. I think it just goes down to being a more transparent police agency and a law enforcement agency so that both sides and that community policing goes back into the thing. And I don't know if I have the answers, but I think we both know there is a problem nationwide, not so much here in our county. But it needs to be solved. And I don't know. I don't have the answer. And I don't know if any one person happens, but I think it boils down to more community involvement.
I agree. I think that accountability is key in this, is that we as law enforcement professionals, we have accountability to the people that we serve and protect. We have accountability as relates to making sure that the men and women are receiving the necessary training, cultural diversity training, de-escalation, all of these things. We as leaders, we as men and women who lead these agencies have an obligation to make sure that we're putting the best out there. Because at the end of the day, we will be held accountable for this. And so what I tell the men and women that I work with and fortunate enough to work with is that we serve the people, and no one man or woman is greater than the people. Everyone is somebody, regardless of where you find them at, how you stop them, whatever. I expect them to be treated with the utmost respect. And so I think when you put that out there in the atmosphere and you treat people with a certain amount of respect and realize that, hey, I'm doing a job, I'm doing a service for this community. And in doing that, I'm going to treat you with a certain level of respect, a certain level of humility. I like to call it policing with compassion. But I can't help but ask you this. So a lot of our viewers may not know, I doubt it, but I'm sure everybody in this part of the region knows Max Maxwell. But my question is, being a very successful African-American male, do you feel sometimes that when you stop, do you feel any different, or do you feel like I'm Max Maxwell, or at the end of the day, regardless of what you have, you still an African-American, and they may not even know who you are?
Well, I would say there's a difference. So like in having where, I was, day to day and not wealthy at all, I think it helps with the type of car you drive, right? It's a calming thing. I think we're all humans, right? So if I'm driving,
so what do you mean? What kind of? Help me out. So when you say it helps, what kind of car you drive? Because I got people out there that's going to be saying, what the hell he mean by that? What kind of car you drive? I drive a Kia.
Yeah. Well, let's just say if you're driving a hoopty, right? And I'm just saying I'm thinking from the officer's perspective.
Yeah.
If an officer's approaching a hoopty, he's probably a little bit more tense. If he's pulling over an African-American guy that looks like me in a hoopty, he's a little bit more tense. Why? It's just true. I don't know why, but if
perception, I can't get that ain't true. That's perception. But go ahead.
If I'm driving my Range Rover, he's a little bit more relaxed.
But you got to realize he or she already know who you are when they stop you. They ran the tag.
Yes, I agree, but it still doesn't. It's still so there's many interactions that happen where tags already ran, but that doesn't let you know who the person is, because there's a lot of officer involved shooting where the person has zero criminal record. So it doesn't put the police on a heightened. I mean, if you're doing a felony traffic stop, there's a difference in that where you call for backup and it's different. But on an everyday basis, most time when it's a officer involved shooting, there's no violent criminal history with that person in the past.
So you saying that a car matters, all those things.
Where you get pulled over matters. Absolutely. You get pulled over in East Winston, you get pulled over on the west side of town, it's totally different.
Okay.
And that's just the truth. I mean, if we want to talk about the truth,
well, we talking truth. We talking truth.
And that's my experience, because I've been on both sides.
Right.
I own a bunch of property in East Winston. I own some property on the west side. When you get pulled over on certain sides, it's just different.
Why do you think that? Why do you say that? Before I weigh in either way, I got to know, why do you feel like that? Because a lot of people tend to think that if they get pulled over in one side of town, it's going to be different on the side of town. If you think it has something to do with because there may be more incidents of crime taking place on this side versus that side,
you got
or a certain group of people. What do you mean
you got
by that?
So one side is a more high crime area. The officer may never have visited that side of town without ever working, right? So you have people that if they grew up in that side of town, it's just like for me and when I go back to like Jamaica, and you hear on the news that Kingston is tough, it's rough, right? When I go back to Kingston, I can walk pretty much anywhere in Kingston, Jamaica, and not feel what you hear that people perceive it as, right? But if you've never been to Kingston, Jamaica, and you hear all of those things and you visit that, you're going to be a very tense individual, right? So it's just the same thing. So if you grew up in this community and you become an officer, you know that the east side of Winston is a little bit more rougher than the west side of Winston.
Well, I can see what you're saying, because I look at some of my own experiences. Well, when I'm in certain parts of town, I feel comfortable when I'm on the east side of town.
I feel comfortable all sides of town.
I grew up over there, and if I'm stopped on the east side, hey, how you doing? But I can relate to what you're saying, because several years ago, before I retired, most of you know that I was a special agent with the federal government. We were working over in a very, I say upper middle class neighborhood over off of Stanley Road. I won't identify the neighborhood by name and address, but it was several of us out there. And the joke that next day in the office was, out of all the cars over there in this predominantly white neighborhood, the police rolled up and stopped me. And the joke was, I asked the guy, why you stopping me out of all these cars sitting in this neighborhood? And I get what you're saying.
We're all humans, right?
Yeah,
so
we humans. So I get what you're saying. I see that. I know that a lot of times our isms, our experience, our exposure, and our perception sometimes dictate our decision.
Mm-hmm.
So I get that. I'll give you that.
And so that's why, like, if you go to like New York and certain areas, like if you are a police in the Bronx district, you probably grew up in the Bronx district. So you know the people in that area. So it goes down to like community policing. You're less tense. You walk up, you know who somebody is, the known this person, the known that person. You don't have that tense because you grew up in this area. And I think that's just part of it. But are we able to do that in our community? No, our community is too spread apart, and officers come from all over places. Law enforcement people come from all over places. But that's the difference in certain areas where you got the smaller communities where you got precincts here and there. And if you grew up in that precinct and police in that precinct, things are a little bit more relaxed. You know, things don't escalate as quickly. You know, police officers say, I'll call your mom. You know, so, you know, there's just different types of in different areas. It's just different outcomes.
So when you look at law enforcement in the 21st century,
mm-hmm.
how do you see it in terms of, is it better than it was 10 years ago? Do you think that there's still a lot of work to be done? What do you think about law enforcement or the criminal justice system?
I think the technology is better to handle very escalated situations, you know, like EOD teams, like bomb teams and SWAT teams. I mean, we're the best, one of the best in the world,
mm-hmm.
our police. But I think as far as regular community policing, I think we've went backwards. So I think that's the most important part of policing is the community aspect of it. And I think it needs to be overhauled. And I think it starts from the beginning of what are we doing and why are we doing it, right? And then if the training starts that way, in my opinion, then I think the outcome is going to be different, right? It's less of I'm here to enforce the law or I'm here to police the community. That sounds different, right? In my opinion, I'm a law enforcement official. I'm a community policing official, or whatever you want to call it. It's just a different, you know, notion to what those two things are.
Well, when I look at it, I don't see it as we're here, phone just blowing up, right? I'm trying to figure out if people trying to call us or what. But anyway, what I was thinking about was this: is that when you think about policing or criminal justice system, I don't look at it as policing the community. I look at it as something as assisting the community with day-to-day issues. But if you think about this, go with me for a second. I had a thought come to mind when you were talking. So if you think about all the systems in our society,
mm-hmm.
all the systems in our society, whether it be the educational system, whether it be the banking system, whether it be the socialization, the religious system in our community, at the end of the day, when all of those systems fail an individual, the criminal justice system is the last system, or as you think about this thin blue line or this line, that criminal justice system is the last system that is present before chaos. Because when an individual or a school system has failed that individual and they can't read and write and they can't get the basic needs, as Maslow talked about in his hierarchy of needs. He talked about food, clothing, and shelter. So when you have someone that cannot find or obtain food, clothing, and shelter, the basic needs, and they cannot compete in this society, because if you think about this society, according to the statistics, is more advanced than it's ever been.
Mm-hmm.
It is more competitive than it ever been. You're not competing against people just in this community now. With the advent of the internet and all the electronics that takes place, you're competing with people all over the country. So we have a lot of, as you said, more mental health issues. We have a lot of issues taking place in our society. At times, our society becomes divided. At times, our society becomes frustrated. And people tend to cling to what they know or what they're comfortable to. But here's something that you've got to remember, is that when all those systems fail an individual, the only system left is the criminal justice system. It catches all or encompasses all of the problems that the other systems did not address. And so when you take that and you look at that from an objective point of view, systems are created by people. People create systems. So you have imperfect people creating imperfect systems. So the system of criminal justice, I'll be the first to admit, it's not perfect, but I think that we're getting better. It's just like when people say, well, how do you feel about being the sheriff? How do you feel about being an African-American sheriff? I see myself as, I know that I'm African-American. That's a given. Just like I know that's a blue line. That's a given. I see myself as, I've got to be the sheriff without the adjectives. I can't be a Democratic, Republican, nonpartisans, black, white. I have to be the sheriff of the people, because at the end of the day, once we start allowing our insecurities, our biasness to play into our decision-making power, that's when that side of the road goes bad. That's when our decision-making is affected. That's when all these problems starts to seep in and divide us. I tell this story all the time, is that years ago, in another part of my life when I was a special agent, and we would be in other countries, other arenas working, and we would be coming back into the embassy in which we were being housed in for a particular time, and you could see that flag waving in a distance, I would get chill bumps. And I'll never forget, I was on the back with one of the nationals from that country on the back of a truck. And I was sharing with him my emotions. And he said to me, how do you get so excited about a symbol that doesn't represent you or doesn't treat you a certain way? And for a moment, I got angry with him, because I said, who are you when I'm over here in your country helping you and yours? And I had to say to myself, how do I respond to that? Do I respond from an emotional standpoint or from an intellectual? And I said to him, I said, I get what you're saying from the outside looking in. But what I would tell you is that she, being America, is not what she used to be. She, being America, may not be what she could be. But she, being America, is better than she used to be. And she is a work in progress. And it is the people that push us forward. It is the people and the diversity that make us greater. Mm-hmm. It is the people that when we have these problems on the side of the road, that we must address them. And that's why transparency is so important to me. That's why I love having real conversations, because some of the things that you said are true. And you said that depending on what kind of car you're driving, depending on where you stopped at, all these things people are saying to themselves out there in the world, out there when they're driving day to day. And I get it. I understand that. But as free thinkers, as people with the ability to resolve issues, we've got to start to unpackage that. And if you're serving law enforcement, you've got to realize that, hey, it does not matter what kind of car that person is driving. It does not matter where I stop them. It does not matter the pigmentation or the situation. What matters is that they are a human being. What matters is that I am a professional and I'm going to treat you with the utmost professionalism. And so this thing about people talk about policing, I hear it all the time. Excuse me, as an African American, all my life I've heard these things because there is I won't say huge, but there's a great difference in our age. So I understand as a young man you have that in you. I get it. And I respect that. But at the end of the day, on behalf of all the men and women that serve across this country, all they want is the respect that you would give any other person. All they want is the respect that they're doing a job. Not all of them come to the table with the mindset of trying to hurt, harm, or inconvenience someone. I think about the story that I don't know if you saw it on Yahoo News. It's just been running since it happened. Went viral about an officer, deputy, that was at the gas pump pumping gas, and a handicapped driver asked him
to pump the gas for him, but didn't have enough money, so he ended up paying it out of his pocket.
So you are news conscious.
Every day.
I like that. See, I thought, a guy like you just don't. But you know what?
You got to stay up on current events if you want to be relevant.
But did you know that guy worked at this department?
I did.
You did?
Yep.
Wow. My point is that when he did that, he had no idea who was watching him. He didn't. He was doing what a human with kindness would do. He changed that woman's life. He gave her the ability not to have to worry about how she was going to get to Asheville on a couple of dollars of gas versus now a full tank of gas. And so, but he's an officer. He's a deputy. And so, but at the same time, when these men and women go home and they take off,
they're just regular people.
They're regular people. They're mothers, their fathers, their sons, their daughters, their uncles, their grandfathers, their nieces, their nephews. And so when we talk about law enforcement, we talk about it from an African-American perspective. Because, we probably have more African-Americans in law enforcement we've ever had in this country. Mm-hmm. I know we have more here now than we've ever had. I think that sometimes we got to push back and say, let me look at this from an objective point of view, from the officer's point of view, before I just rush in and say, he did this, she did that. Because remember, on the side of the road, one is professional and does this several times a day. And
one may do it once in 5 years.
Exactly. That's being stopped. Exactly.
And listen, for me, I think the main thing is, like, when I was younger, and I lived in a neighborhood.
How much younger?
When I was a kid.
Okay.
When I was a young kid, if I did something wrong and my parents found out about it, they would discipline me. Right? And the neighborhood knew. If I did something at the rec center and I did something wrong, my mom would discipline me. Now, what happens is, if your mom doesn't discipline you, then they look at the whole family as bad. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
So I think that's the same way the community looks at any law enforcement agency, is that when an officer does something bad, the parent has to discipline them. And if they don't, then they look at the whole family as bad.
Right.
So that's just the same concept. So whether it's got to be an inside agency or an outside agency, that person has to be reprimanded for their actions. Period. And I think if more of that happens, then that whole stigma of the entire law enforcement community is bad would go away. Because no matter what you do, look, I'm an investor. There's bad investors every day. There's a show called American Greed just for those bad investors, right?
Right.
So you're going to have that whole pot. But guess what? There's a body of agency that disciplines those people so that the whole community of investors don't are looked at as bad. So if there's a continuous push of disciplining people that are doing wrong, then I think that kind of takes away that whole stigma of that people can say law enforcement is bad or good or bad or whatever their point is. Because most of my interactions with police have been well. A lot of my friends don't have the same stories though.
So you're saying that a lot of your interactions have been good?
Yeah, but you got to remember, I come from a little different. When I was 17, my first job in the military, I was a law enforcement officer.
Right, right. I remember that.
So I understand how to survive the stop.
Right. You weren't driving a Range Rover, were you?
No. No. My car that I had 3-4 years ago was a 04 Volkswagen Jetta.
Right. I was just being a little sarcastic, humor. But what I was thinking was that what I would like for people to take from this is that if you're not driving a high-end car,
you don't have to. I don't want that to be taken away because I haven't always had a high-end car or whatever.
Right. I had to clown you about that.
Yeah.
So if the driver is not driving a high-end car and they just happen to be ordinary people like myself,
like me.
Yeah, right. You got jokes. What I would like to take away from this is that be compliant. If there's an issue, address it after the stop. Contact that law enforcement, internal affairs. Contact a supervisor at that law enforcement agency, because there are going to be many more stops today, tomorrow, and the next day.
But I think that's a great statement. But in the overall thinking is that you think everybody's on the same baseline of respect, same upbringing, and there's some people that don't treat anybody good.
True.
Right, they get pulled over. They don't treat the clerk at the grocery store, the pharmacist, anybody with respect.
No, we don't have people like that work here.
No, I'm not saying police officers. Yeah. I'm saying regular, I'm not saying law enforcement.
Talking about citizens.
Regular people in the world. They just have bad attitudes.
Right.
So what happens is the one trained individual has to overcome this person's ignorance.
I agree with that.
And not escalate and try to de-escalate and realize, I'm just going to write this man a ticket or I'm going to arrest him and I'm going to go about my day because I got dinner at 8 o'clock with my wife. You know, if you escalate it, it can go good or it can go bad. It can go in your favor or not go in your favor because we don't know the capacity of that person.
True.
So it works on both sides. Like you said, one person gets pulled over 5 times, one time in 5 years, and one person pulls over 5 persons a day. So you gotta. There's a balance of who's the professional, who's the trained, steady-minded, because you do psych evaluations on all your law enforcement people. Who's the steady-minded person versus who's Blow Joe? I don't know.
Right. That's a good point. I like that. So as we kind of come to a close, I love when we have guests on here. I love our guests taking a minute because I want the people to know not just about off the cuffs, but I want them to know about who is this guy that's sitting here that's giving us information. So I want to know, I know who Max is. I want you to just tell us who Max is. Who is Max Maxwell?
That's a good question. So I'm a first-generation American. My parents are Jamaican. I came to Winston-Salem in '93. Went to elementary, middle, high school here. I didn't attend college. I went off to the military, came back, and I'm now a real estate investor. I have a real estate investment firm, and I do what I can in the community. We were at a school not recently and helping out those people. But I love Winston-Salem. I could live anywhere in the world at this point, but I decided to stay here and be home and make my community better. I want to be something of change here. And not that anything's bad. I love Winston-Salem. I just don't see myself going anywhere. I want to be, I want to make the community even better than it is now.
I love that. I love what you said is that, and that's true, you could live anywhere. I know that. I'm grateful that you chose to stay here in this community. I'm grateful to make it better. I think that if a lot of us took the attitude is, how do we make it better? Mm-hmm. How do we increase something rather than decrease it? How do we bring something to a situation and make it better? I think that's the force multiplier.
We all got to do our part.
We got to do our part.
Everybody.
Whether it's law enforcement, whether it's Max, whether it's Dave, no matter who it is, we've got to do our part. So I think that's a great note to leave on. And the note that I want to leave on is that this atmosphere that we're living in, this atmosphere is changeable. Mm-hmm. And when we do our part, not only do we change the atmosphere, we change outcomes. Yeah. And if we continue to change outcomes and change atmospheres, that's when you see the magic and a chain reaction.
Big change.
And that's when you'll see this perfection. That's when you'll see this thing that we all hope for. Yeah. That's when you see this thing that when we say we want to be all that we can be. So I welcome you anytime that you're in the neighborhood, to swing by, stop by. We're definitely going to have you on again. And I'm just excited that you're here, what you're doing in the community. And I want to thank you and your staff for coming by for
Absolutely.
Off the Cuffs today.
Can I challenge you one thing before we leave?
Depend, but go ahead, because you're going to do it anyway.
Yeah. So I just want to challenge you to keep being transparent and keep having conversations with the community, because I think it's going to help, it's going to start a trend. And we can talk about nationwide all we want, but I think if we change it here in our community, it will become reciprocal to other communities across the country. And I think if you set an example of how a law enforcement agency should be ran and how they should be transparent and have regular conversations with the community, I think you could be on the brink of something special and put your foot in changing law enforcement nationwide.
Appreciate that. That's a good point. A lot of people call a lot of flack about why does a law enforcement agency need a podcast? I mean, couldn't you spend your time doing a lot of other things? I'm sure I could, but I spend about 12 hours a day here. If you notice, I'm a little hoarse now. I love doing what we do. But I think that in the era, in the day in which we're living in, law enforcement has changed.
100%.
Our society has changed. We have social media platforms that we've never had. There was no internet when I came through high school in '79. There was no Facebook and Twitter and all of those things, platforms that I don't even know about. And I think that this podcast, being one of the first in the country to do this, I think that our purpose and our design was to put information out.
That's it.
To have real conversations. None of this is scripted. All of this is real conversation.
Off the cuff.
Off the cuffs, exactly. And off the cuffs means that it's a dual meaning. We had this conversation the other day. Off the cuffs is about conversation that is heartfelt, conversation that law enforcement, we can't arrest our way out of some situations. We can't arrest our way out of this. We've got to educate. We've got to disseminate information. We've got to do it in a way that it is fair, not to what we're trying to tell you, thus says law enforcement, but it's information that gives you a chance to think about, ponder it, put us to the test, question us, sit across from us, ask us difficult questions. Because at the end of the day, communication is key. And when people think that they can talk through some things, I think they think that maybe there's a chance, maybe there's hope. Mm-hmm. And people are making decisions based on hope, what they think is going to happen, or can I count on this happening? And I think that by putting this information out, by bringing people here to talk about issues, to talk about concepts, to talk about law enforcement, it just gives us another tool to be in the community without actually having to be there physically. So we want to be there not only physically, we want to be there in terms of informational, we want to be there in terms of letting the community know that we are present. And if it takes us beyond this place and this space, then so be it. We welcome the criticisms. We welcome what comes with this. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, we hope that we're changing and saving lives.
I think you're on the right path.
And I appreciate that. And once again, I want to thank you for being here at Off the Cuffs. And as always, may God continue to smile upon us. Thank you.